Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing well. So today, in honour of Nonfiction November, the month in which all of us on BookTube vow to read at least a little bit more nonfiction than we usually would, I thought that I would go through and have a look at some of the books that I picked up solely on the recommendations of BookTubers. BookTube is where I and many other people get a vast number of our recommendations. When it comes to fiction, I would honestly say like around about 90% of my fiction reading comes solely from BookTube recommendations, and even saying that, I think that's a conservative estimate. I actually think it's a lot more. Whereas, interestingly, when it comes to non-fiction, I would say it's kind of half and half. Half of my non-fiction reading being based around other people on BookTube's recommendations, and then the other half being things that I've searched out for myself. And I kind of attribute that to the fact that when I was first starting to get back into reading and when I was first watching BookTube, when it came to non-fiction, not all of the BookTubers that I watched were really into the same kinds of non-fiction that I am. I feel especially since I've started doing BookTube videos for myself, I found many more people who are into the same kinds of non-fiction as me, particularly when it comes to history non-fiction, but that really wasn't the case when I started watching BookTube back in 2013. So yes, I will be going through a little list of books that I've picked up based on BookTuber recommendations. I will also be linking any relevant links to their channels and any videos that I mention. I just thought it would be a really nice way to both support non-fiction writing, but also to kind of raise up some of the voices on BookTube that I tend to get a lot of recommendations from. So the first non-fiction book in question that I picked off because of a BookTuber recommending it is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. This book I picked up solely on the recommendation of Olive from A Book Olive. And I feel like it's quite appropriate to start off this video by mentioning a book that she recommended because Olive is the reason that we have Nonfiction November on BookTube. I picked this up last year after hearing her rave review about this. And I'm so glad that I did, because this has really become one of my favourite pieces of nonfiction. As the title suggests, this book really tracks the science of sleep and why it is so important that we as humans get our recommended a lot of sleep. Matthew Walker also interrogates our current work culture and the way that it really does not prioritise sleep. Having a work culture where work-life balance is really skewed, and the idea of employees getting their essential rest and relaxation time is seen as laziness. Despite the fact that I myself am not really much of a sciencey person, I have to say I was really hooked by this, and the first page will just shock you and will make you want to go to sleep straight away. I feel like, especially since lockdown, this is a book that I definitely need to reread, because I will be the first to admit that my sleep cycle since lockdown has just gone plummeted right off the cliff. Do let me know in the comment section if you can pinpoint the very first booktuber that you subscribed to. For me, it was definitely Lena Norms, and I blame Lena for a good number of books that I've bought over the years. One non-fiction book in question is Stop What You're Doing and Read This. This is an essay collection by multiple different authors all about books and the importance of reading and why it is that libraries and having public funding for reading is so important. We've got essays here from Zadie Smith, Mark Haddon, Jeanette Winterson, Michael Rose and Nicholas Carr. I actually think the very first video that I ever watched by Lena was actually talking about this book, and I don't think it's still on her channel anymore. I think it's probably available if you are a Patreon supporter. However, she did recently mention this in one of her latest videos, which I'll link down below. I read this back in 2014, which, as I've said before, is when I was really starting to try and read more, and this was really like the perfect book for me to really spur on my reading and motivate me. Another Lena Norms recommendation was The Time in Between, a memoir of hunger and hope by Nancy Tucker. This is a memoir in which Nancy Tucker chronicles her experiences as a teenager being in and out of hospital with anorexia and bulimia. I think this was one of the very first memoirs that I ever read, and I remember it just being both harrowing but also hopeful. And I remember what particularly inspired me to pick this book up was an interview between Lena and Nancy, in which she just talked so fantastically, so eloquently about her experiences and what she hopes that people, especially young girls, really take from reading about her experiences. A non-fiction author that I've particularly been prompted to pick up because of BookTube is Mark Forsyth. I think the piece of non-fiction that he is most well known for is the Horologicon, and I remember particularly Sana from Books and Quills really recommending this. So I have picked this up. I have also picked up the Etymologicon, and another little pamphlet that was really popular a couple of years ago was The Unknown Unknown, Bookshops and the Delight of Not Getting What You Wanted. However, I will say my favourite of his books is A Short History of Drunkenness. How, why, where and when humankind has got merry from the Stone Age to the present. Which this book itself I haven't heard anybody else talking about, so it's not really a non-fiction book that I've picked up because of BookTube, but I probably wouldn't have picked up the author had I not heard such great things from BookTube. Mark Forsyth is just a fantastic author. Anything that he puts his pen to, I'll be reading. He's just so funny and witty and very informed. And I always feel like I've come out of his books both entertained and educated. I feel like it's really interesting how sometimes the books that I pick up because of BookTube is because somebody has been talking about them in every single video. They've appeared in their wrap-ups, they've appeared in their favourite books of all time in different recommendation videos, and you end up really associating a book with a booktuber. However, sometimes I will be in that kind of mood where I will watch, say, a book haul where a booktuber will show a bunch of different books and I will particularly latch onto one. And it doesn't matter if they've read it or not, just because that person has mentioned the book, I'm like, yes, that is a book that I must read. I feel like this occasionally will happen, especially with new books. However, one of those times where it happened, I ended up picking up Rife, 21 Stories from Britain's Youth, edited by Nikesh, Shukla and Sammy Jones. And this was purely because Eric Carl Anderson ended up showing this in a book haul one time, and I have never heard about this book since then. But for some reason, I was in one of those moods and he showed this and I was like, oh, that looks interesting, and I've read other things by Nikesh Shukla, purchased. This, once again, is a collection of essays all about what it is like to live in Britain as a young person, which according to this book, I am not anymore because they designate young person as being people under 24. Oh, how depressing. On the other hand, you will have booktubers who will mention a book so much that you're just like, fine, I will read this thing, fine. Such was the case with Romantic Outlaws, The Extraordinary Lives of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley, which is prompted purely by how many times Jennifer Brooks mentioned this book. Jennifer has a lot to answer for some of my spending habits this year, because not only have I picked this up because of her recommendation, saying this is her favourite book that she's read so far this year, I've also picked up a collection of Percy Bysshe Shelley and a collection of Lord Byron poetry. And I'm not regretting it at all, they were all fantastic reads, but it's her fault. But I'm very, very glad that she did, because this was an absolutely fantastic biography. This both tells the story of both of these incredible women's lives, but also tracks the similarities within their lives. As both women were incredibly intelligent and educated, both of them had whirlwind romances where they ended up having children out of wedlock, and both of them ended up writing world-changing literature, that being A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft and Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. It is a fantastic, fantastic book, and I have to thank Jennifer for her recommendation. Another piece of literary non-fiction that I picked up was What Matters in Jane Austen, 20 Crucial Puzzles Solved by John Mullan. This read was completely inspired by the Queen of Jane Austen, Katie from Books and Things, and this was just such an interesting little read for a Jane Austen fan like me, tracking different things to do with Jane Austen that you might not necessarily have thought of. Questions to do with what do different characters read in Jane Austen? How much does money matter in Jane Austen? Why does weather seem to crop up as a prominent theme in Jane Austen? Is it risky to go to the seaside? Because if you've read some of her novels, you'll notice that the seaside tends to be a place of danger. The chapter that I was particularly drawn to within this book was the very first one, which I think Katie has mentioned as well, which is about how much does age matter in Jane Austen? And particularly talking about, especially when it comes to Pride and Prejudice, how the ages that we think of these characters being is not necessarily what might actually be the case. John Mullan argues that Mrs. Bennet, for example, is probably much younger than we often think of her. She is often portrayed as being a woman in her 50s and 60s, though he argues that if you think about it, she's probably much more likely to be early 40s and not much older, because her eldest daughter Jane is 21, 22, and she was probably not much older than 18 when she married Mr. Bennet. And it's really talking about how does it colour your perceptions of different characters to know that they were much younger or much older. Two other examples within Pride and Prejudice being Mr. Collins, who we often think of as being much older than he actually is. He's often played by actors who are in their late 30s, early 40s, despite the fact that canonically in the text he is described as being a 25-year-old. And just for context, like, I am 25, hello. How do we see Mr. Collins differently if we think of him as a 25-year-old? I feel like we probably see him as being a lot more naive and a lot more innocent than he would be in the adaptations, where he is a lot less sympathetic. Whereas if we think of him as like this little lost puppy who is trying to appease his elders, like, you can understand that a lot more. John Mullan also makes the argument that Caroline Bingley, the younger sister of Mr. Bingley, is probably much more closer in age to Lydia Bennet than Lizzie. How do we therefore see the attitude and the behaviour of Caroline Bingley differently if we think that she may possibly still be very much a child compared to Lizzie's more adult woman? Next up, a booktuber who I have taken a few non-fiction recommendations off over the years is Jean from Bookish Thoughts. I remember particularly Lowborn by Kerry Hudson, which is one of my favourite books that I've read this year, was actually taken from her recommendation. This is all about the author Kerry Hudson's experience living in poverty in Aberdeen, what her experience was like growing up, but also how she got out of that situation and then as an adult returning to these poorest parts of Scotland and really trying to raise public consciousness about what it is like to live in poverty in Britain. And particularly an author who I may not have read if not for Jean's recommendation is Mary Beard. I mean, there had to be something to do with classics if it was Jean, right? Because yes, whilst I did do a history degree, we didn't touch classical civilization at all. The earliest history that I tended to study was around about the year 400. So unfortunately, Mary Beard never came into the equation. So here I've got SPQR, a history of ancient Rome, which is very, very good. And also Women in Power, which is just a little thing of 2 of Mary Beard's speeches about women through history. Another non-fiction book that I picked up purely from watching one video where it was mentioned, once again, is Mom Darling, 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret by Craig Brown. This was picked up after seeing Lauren from Lauren and the Books pick it up, and I'm not even sure if she enjoyed it, I can't quite remember. This is a book that tracks Princess Margaret's life and particularly different people's encounters with her. It is not a standard like chronological biography, it is just like little snippets here and there trying to paint up a portrait of this woman from the 99 glimpses that people have. And I will say this was an interesting one because some of the cases in here are factual and others are just completely made up stories. Like a dream that somebody once had of Princess Margaret makes it into here and it's like, okay, right. An interesting book definitely, but maybe not a definitive portrait of Princess Margaret. A little bit earlier in my BookTube watching journey, I ended up picking up Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay, which is a collection of essays on the recommendation of Ashley over at Climb the Stacks. And I remember she picked this up around the time that it had just been published, and I thought that that was very significant because Ashley didn't tend to read many new releases. So I was like, oh well, I must pick this up if she's picked it up. This is an essay collection all about feminism, pop culture, race. I feel like this essay collection is where the term Bad Feminist came from, and I actually haven't picked it up and reread it since that first time that I read it a few years ago. So I'd be really interested to see how relevant some of the essays in here still are. Anything that could potentially be expanded on now. I feel like this is a book that spurred a lot of people to think about feminism and how it pertains to media. I think it would be really interesting to read this again and kind of get a sense of how the conversation has really evolved and changed since then. So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson is a book that I particularly associate with Ariel Bissett. I know she's talked about it a number of times, and once again, another book that I feel like if I were to read it again now would feel a little bit outdated because this was published in 2015. And I feel like that conversation around public shaming and around cancel culture has really just changed so much since then. Both in the ways where that seems to have strengthened, but also in ways that we are seeing where calling people out on their bad behaviour doesn't necessarily mean that anything of actual value will actually happen. Am I maybe thinking about a certain president of a certain country and how all of his bad behaviour gets repeatedly called out and yet nothing of actual concrete value is done to change it? Maybe. Oh god, at least we can say he's been voted out. Thank you, America. We are now coming to the last non-fiction book that I can definitely pinpoint a specific booktuber to why I picked it up is I Am, 17 Brushes with Death by Maggie O'Farrell. And this is a book that I picked up particularly after hearing Jen Campbell raving about it. I believe this was in her best books of 2018, and I think she said something like it was both chilling but vulnerable, but also powerful. And that is definitely a great description for this book. This is a memoir particularly focused on Maggie O'Farrell's different experiences with death, both due to medical mishaps, but also due to violence. It starts off with a really chilling account where Maggie is off walking one day and she comes across a man. He is kind of creepy and she's a bit wary of him, but she manages to get past him without incident. However, she later finds out that this man actually murdered other girls that he met across that path. And suddenly she is confronted with the fact that that death could have been hers. And this book really reinforces this idea that you just don't know what day is going to be your last. It's an absolutely fantastic memoir and I highly recommend it. I'm just noticing now quite how many essay collections and memoirs I have picked up because of booktuber recommendations. I wonder why. And now to round off, I'm going to talk about a couple of books here that I know that I picked up specifically because I heard about them on BookTube, but I can't quite pinpoint who it was who talked about them. Firstly, we have this beautiful thing, which is What We See in the Stars, an illustrated tour of the night sky by Kelsey O'Sid. I hope I said that right. And I know for a fact I would not have picked this up if not for BookTube. Because as I've said before, science and astronomy, it's not really my thing. But I remember seeing people talking about this, and I think it was particularly like Christmas 2017 that I remember hearing loads of buzz about this. And I was like, well, it's so beautiful, I can't not. Let me just find some pretty pictures for you. Got this. Deep space. Oh, isn't it so pretty? And then finally, the last book that I'm going to talk to you about today is a book that I think everybody and their mum's dog has recommended on BookTube, and that is Educated by Tara Westover. Another memoir, woo! I mean, can you call yourself a booktuber if you haven't read Educated? That really is the question. So I'm sure you've heard many people talking about this memoir. This is all about the author Tara Westover's experiences growing up with parents who were Mormon survivalists, who believed that the end of the world was coming and that they had to be prepared for that. They lived very isolated, they did not believe in modern medicine, and as a result, Tara never received a birth certificate and she never received education, at least until she was older and therefore able to separate from her family. This book chronicles was her growing up and her relationship with her family, and also her journey to get that formal education that she really craved. I feel like this over the past few years really has become the BookTube book, and you can kind of see why. A memoir which is all about books and the importance of education, like that, we eat that up. So that is it. Those are all of the books that I have been particularly prompted to read as a result of all of the recommendations that I've gotten from the fantastic world that is BookTube. Do let me know if you've read any of these books, and let me know of any books that you have picked up based on recommendations from BookTubers. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye!